I'm going to start recording now, and then hopefully if you missed something or you want to go back and watch it again, you will know where to go and find it. Just a few housekeeping again before I introduce our two presenters tonight. If you can just make sure that your mics stay muted. If you have any questions, there's a function at the bottom of your screen where you can ask to put your hand up if you have a question. At any time, you can do that. And I know that both Jenna and Jocelyn will go over all that with you as well. Also, please feel free to use the chat at any time as well if you've got questions. And I know that I think Jenna will be responding to the questions as the presentation goes on. So I'm just going to let in a few more people here, and then I will get started. Okay, one more here. Okay, so tonight we are fortunate to have both Jenna and Jocelyn with us tonight. And Jocelyn Campbell has been a classroom teacher for 18 years. She has a master's in counseling from UBC. She was our home hospital teacher here in our school district. She's been a school and family consultant, and she's currently in the role of a mental health clinician for the past 12 years here at SD73. Jocelyn also has a master's degree in counseling psychology, and she's a registered clinical counselor. So welcome, Jocelyn, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. Jenna is also joining us tonight, and Jenna is a mental health clinician and a social emotional coordinator for the Kamloops Thompson School District. She holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and is a registered clinician through the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. Jenna holds a bachelor's of education and has worked within the Kamloops community in both the therapeutic and educational capacities for the last 15 years. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to all of our families and participants. I am just going to make, Jocelyn, do you want to be host?
I'm muted. That's good to go. Jenna is going to be the co-host.
I see. Okay, so you need me to give you...
Give that access to Jenna, please.
Okay, I can do that. I can do that. So while I'm doing that, do you want to...
Sure, we'll get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I have to say this is a different parent participation feeling for me because normally I'm in front of folks and can see and get your reactions a little bit. And then I do have a tendency to use my hands a lot. So this is a little bit of a challenge, but we are so thrilled to be joining you tonight. And Jenna is a new colleague here of mine, and I'm just thrilled to have her. So as Deanna mentioned, before we get started, just to let you know, most of the presentation will be presented via PowerPoint, and it will have accompanying conversation and dialogue that goes.
No, here we go. Okay, sorry.
That's fine. So how we're going to do it tonight is that we would love to sort of have the opportunity that you can, in the moment, ask questions, but it is a bit hard on this format. So if you go to the bottom and you see the section that says chat, please click on that and just type your questions in, and Jenna is going to respond in real time. She and I have been joking all day. It's kind of like when I go shopping online and, you know, Tiffany or Bob come up on the bottom corner and say, can I help you with your purchase today? So that will sort of be Jenna's role, and she'll be sort of yeah, thanks, Jenna. Would you like to add that to your cart? Do you have any questions about that item? So that's sort of what we're going to be doing as we go through. Okay, our plan is to be at about an hour and 15 minutes. Realistically, I think we kind of reach a saturation point at that level, and I think we just wanted to add in our main focus for this is for elementary school age students from kindergarten to grade 6 or 7. If you have a student or child that you're concerned about above that age group, we will be doing another session in January on the 20th, and that may just be suitable for yourselves. So just sort of wanted to give you a heads up about our sort of target area that we're going to be touching on. Okay, so Jenna, are we ready to screen share and get this party going?
I think we're ready. Thanks so much for the introduction, Deanna and Jocelyn. So I'm just noticing that now with the screen share I might lose the chat, so I'm attempting here to log in on a second screen so I can answer questions on the chat while I'm also sharing the slides. So just a quick note also, yes, please make sure that your mics are muted and we will begin. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenna. Okay, so we're just going to do a little sort of system where I probably will cough or just say we're good to go. So we'll move across the first slides fairly good. Thanks, Jenna. Next one. Before we begin, Jen and I both really want to take a moment to acknowledge the unceded territory of the Tk'emlúps people on which we are working and spending time this evening. It was a gorgeous day to be in Kamloops, and we are very fortunate to live here and be on this unceded territory for sure. So tonight we kind of have broken it down into some talking points or some areas that we want to make sure that we touch base on. The first one is we're going to make sure that we're all have the same sort of level of knowledge in regards to anxiety. So we kind of call it Anxiety 101, and it's just basic anxiety information so that you can come to the tools and strategies with some basic knowledge. So once we know about anxiety, hang on, Jenna, go back. Once we know about anxiety, we're going to move into tools and strategies. And then finally, it's okay, I can remember. Finally, our final slide is going to be talking about how to access more help if you're concerned about your young one and want to make sure that you can access more help. Okay. So it's always good to just start and normalize the whole thing about anxiety because everyone has it. It is not something unique to just certain people or certain children. And we need to talk about the brain and we need to sort of have a sense of what's going on because the reality is anxiety happens in actually a 6-inch space between our ears. So it's important that we have some knowledge just basically about our brain. So tucked inside the middle of our brain that we normally don't see is a small part of our brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is about the size of an almond. It's not incredibly big, but it for sure is a very key role and spot for emotions and emotional reactions to things. So it's amazing that this little almond actually has so much control and power over our day-to-day functioning. So we want to just make sure that you realize that anxiety actually comes from this one small little almond in your brain. Okay. So anxiety is just one of many emotions, and we want to make sure that we normalize it. So when children are young, say maybe starting kindergarten, they for sure know sad and they often know happy, and they're usually really good with angry. But as they age and get a little bit older, kids start to add in more vocabulary: frustrated, disappointed, upset, defeated. And so what we want to do is make sure that we realize that anxiety or worry is just one of many emotions that we have. So it kind of just falls under that big umbrella of emotions. And just talking about emotions, it's really important that no matter the age of your child, that we try to get to a place that we can name emotions. Because if we can have your child name their emotion, you will find a reduction just straight across the board in behavior. So if you're sitting at the kitchen table and they're crumpling up their homework and you have some yelling and I don't want to do this and whatever, what you really want to do is be able to get them to a place that they can say to you, man, I'm feeling frustrated with this math because I don't get it. So having that ability to sort of name an emotion is great. So anxiety is totally natural. It's normal. All human beings have it. And all human beings have this naturally programmed reaction, which they often call the fight-flight response, fight-flight-freeze response. It's our built-in alarm reaction, and it's tucked into our brainstem, and it's there to sort of help us really function well. Jane, I think we'll just stay there for a second. So that alarm system is something that we all have. And what I say about anxious kids is that they have a tendency that their alarm system is just a little more sensitive or a little more reactive to things in the environment than maybe some other systems are. So I often use with kids the analogy of a smoke detector, which is a type of alarm, or a car alarm. And what would we do if we had, like, they serve a purpose, they're there, they're good, they're great, we need them. But if the smoke alarm in our house went off every time someone did a load of laundry in the dryer, every time the microwave went on, every time that we did something that had any heat, your sister straightening her hair, if the alarm system went off that often, it would be exhausting, number one. And the second part is eventually we'd get to the place of saying, well, we don't want to get rid of the smoke alarm, but we're going to have to tweak it or do some maintenance or fix it up so that it only works when we need it to work. And so quite often that's a nice sort of analogy for kids because they get alarms and they understand alarm systems. It's that we need it, but their alarm system's just going off a little too often. So that's kind of a nice way to sort of include that for kids. Okay, Jenna. So if we think about flight, fright, fight, and freeze, I like to use these sort of examples with kids, and they also work really well with adults. So the fight response would be like the growly, grumpy, miserable bear response. And most of the time, parents tell me that they get a lot of this at home and maybe not so much at school. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that happens. But it's the door slamming, you can't make me, kind of stuff that you can get in your house. The flight response, hold on, Jenna, go back. Stay there for a bit, okay? The flight response, I kind of use it as an analogy of a bunny rabbit. So you've got big ears, you're listening to things, you've got a very sensitive nose, you're sensing your environment very, very well, and you know this does not feel comfortable, and you scurry off. So quite often at school, this could be the student who leaves frequently to go to the bathroom. I've had some students who, in the older intermediate grades, mom drops them off at the front door and they walk through school and they go out the back door and they spend the day somewhere else. So there can be lots of reactions that we have that sort of flight, get me out of here kind of reaction. Parents at home often describe that as company comes over and they just are like in the bathroom or they lock themselves away. They don't want to meet new people. The freeze response is the reaction of sort of deer in the headlights. And that would also be things like you don't want to answer questions in class. So you just sit there really quietly and you don't go anywhere, but you hope that you can just get overlooked. You just freeze and stay put until the danger has left. And most kids tell me that they do a lot of freeze at school. They get very nervous if the teacher is asking a question and they don't know what the answer is. They really hope that someone else will answer it or put up their hand or someone else will step in to sort of do that. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about these three responses because we all have all three. They change over time. Sometimes you may have a child in your home who does a lot more flight and then all of a sudden they turn into sort of the grizzly bear, and that's kind of normal. It's not always the exact same. And you'll also find that as different situations come up, you'll get different responses. And being a human that I am and having anxiety like everyone else does, what you're sort of noticing is that I have all of these too. So growly bear is when my kids were supposed to be home at 11 p.m. curfew and they showed up at 11:01. I got myself amped up. I was worried about everything that could have possibly happened. And they walked in the door and I can guarantee you they got growly bear. Where have you been? Do you know I've been sitting here waiting for you? And really they were just a minute late, but they got the growly bear. The flight response, that bunny response, I do that. And I notice I do that when call display comes up and it's my mother-in-law. And I'm like, oh no, I do the sort of flight scurry away. I'm not answering that. And I do freeze. Of course I do freeze. If I'm in a staff meeting or something at work and they say, can I have a few volunteers to come up and do a role play? Oh my gosh, I just hope that the carpet will swallow me up or that a couple of the other really keen people will put their hands up and do it. So we all have them. Kids all have them. Absolutely, you see the bear often more at home. And you need to remember, especially if your kid's gone to school for 6 hours, in front of their peer group, they've probably kept it together pretty well and tried to manage their anxiety. And quite often when they get home, it's a safe place. Mom and dad and your family is always going to be there for you. And quite often that's the place that you get more of a bear response. So we do all of them. You'll notice I have a little tiny picture of a possum. And this isn't one that I often hear about, but one of my older clients told me about that. They have a tendency when they're feeling anxious to just sort of like do a play dead thing. And they don't play dead, but they put their hoodie over their head, and they put their head down as if they're sleeping. So it's different than freeze. Freeze, you look totally like you're in the environment and you're doing the same as everybody else, but you're just hopeful that something will bypass you. Possum is more like almost like a turtle response. And I didn't realize that possums can play dead for like 45 minutes and just a way of protecting them from their environment. So sometimes we will, especially in intermediate grades, run into students who put up their hoodies and they just hunker down and they almost seem to be disengaging. Doesn't mean they're not listening and doesn't mean they're not learning. It just seems to be their way of coping. Okay. So we need to talk a little bit about anxiety and when it comes up, and it's totally expected. Anxiety is expected when there's a transition. So starting back to school is a huge transition. Going from maybe if you're in grade 6 and you're moving to the Brock Middle School is a big transition. Anxiety is going to come up too in times of great stress. So are we seeing increased rates of anxiety right now with the longevity of COVID and hearing of the flooding and rivers and things that are nearby our home? Absolutely. We are noticing a huge increase in anxiety with kids because I think it's just another layer that is really, really hard for them to cope. And at the end of the session, we'll talk a little bit about the news and how to sort of mitigate some of that. Especially with COVID, there's a lot of increased diligence and a lot of increased worry. So we want to make sure we touch base on that before we finish. If there are significant changes in your family, like conflict, marital separation, if there's an illness in the family, if there's a move, all those things, we can expect kids to present as being more anxious. And so those would be normal anxiety responses. And during developmental hurdles, starting school, going to your first sleepover, all those things can tend to be a bit more of a challenge for anxious kids. And we have to say that things like anxiety and starting school, it's not always the eldest kid that has the anxiety. Sometimes it can be the youngest, and you're a bit perplexed because it seems like they've watched everybody else go off to school. But it's not about that. It's about how their brain is processing all of those things and how that amygdala is kicking in. So we want to make sure that we're just really respectful and aware of what's happening for our children, for sure. Okay. So when we talk about developmental anxieties, there's certain things that we see at certain ages, for sure, and they're really normal. So for youngsters who are between that 3 to 6, quite often we have lots of worries about dark and storms, imaginary creatures, animal separation, and loss of their caregiver. And I think with media and things that are happening today, it's amazing to me some of the things that kids are aware of that I wouldn't have known. So of course it's hard for their brains. Like I meet 5 and 6-year-olds who know a lot about zombies and all sorts of things that I don't think at that age I would have had that knowledge. But I'm probably the oldest person. Probably the oldest person on the call here today, but that's sort of just an area of what we expect in that age group. Those would be sort of normal. So moving up to the 7 to 9-year-olds, we start to move into more physical dangers and things about world events. A little higher ages, when we get to 10 to 12, it's about social concerns, what's happening with their peer group, who likes them, who doesn't like them, all that sort of stuff. And school performance kicks in for some kids. And then when we move into high school, these are kind of normal developmental pieces such as social judgment and acceptance, and then also looking at where the future is sort of taking them. Okay. So when is anxiety a problem if we all have it? So we know anxiety is a problem when the reactions are excessive, which means we have reactions that are pretty significant. They're interfering in life. They are causing a lot of distress in the family home or for the child, and they are happening a little too often. So remember that that piece of our brain has this built-in alarm system, and it really can't tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. So in the brain, the reaction and some of the things that your body is feeling are the exact same thing in terms of an anxiety provoking situation to something that would be a threat to your life. So if you think about you're driving your car and you're putting your foot on the brake and the brakes don't seem to be working and you're panicked, I can meet kids who have that exact same feeling about doing an oral report at school. The difference is one is a real threat and the other one is an imagined threat. And so your brain connections are getting a little bit off kilter and need a bit of tweaking. So we talk about going back to that alarm system, that we have to get it to be a little bit more sensitive to what it needs to be sensitive to. Okay. So anxiety is on a continuum. Just so you know, it goes from low through to medium to high, and it goes back and forth all the time. I always like to let kids know, okay, Jenna, we're good, that really we have to realize that anxiety is going to come and go in our lives, and anxiety is like a wave. And I talk with kids, no matter if they're in kindergarten or all the way up to grade 12. The fact is that worry never, ever lasts forever. Even the most significant panic attack stops. And so if I meet a child who is just so distressed about attending school, they don't feel that distress for days. Eventually that will ride out, the wave gets smaller, and eventually they get to a shoreline. And we know that it feels super uncomfortable to ride out the wave, but it is not going to last forever. So it is not a condition that stays with you 24/7, day and night, for days and days and days. In the moment, does it feel pretty awful? Yeah, it does. Okay. So we all have anxiety. We know that. Anxiety actually serves a purpose, and it can be very helpful for us. So it is fleeting, which means it doesn't last very long. It is adaptive, which means it helps you sort of get prepared or adapted to a situation that's going to happen. And it can enhance your performance. So if I think about getting ready for this evening, we've been sort of just puttering around and pulling our PowerPoint together and organizing, and it's all been very casual. But I have to tell you, about 5:30, my stomach started to do a few butterflies. And I've done tons of presentations, but it's helpful anxiety. It's kicking in a little bit to sort of help me up my game a little bit. It's helping me get prepared, think about what I'm going to do. It's enhancing my performance. Unhelpful anxiety is the sort that lingers and stays for a long time. It is something we call maladaptive, which means it actually doesn't let you do what you want to do, and it hinders your performance. It actually can put you in a situation that you freeze or are unable to do what you would like to do. So we all need anxiety. We all have anxiety. It is part of our human being condition. But what often happens with our youngsters is that anxiety gets to a place that it seems to be starting to shift over to the place of unhelpful. And that's when we want to make sure we kick in. If I could give an example there, we used to run a group called the Worry Dragons, and a lovely mom signed her daughter up because when she goes to Highland dance competitions for a couple of hours before the competition, she doesn't feel very great and she has a bit of an upset stomach. And so we had to go and have a conversation about how that's actually helpful anxiety. It's kicking in, it's getting her prepared for something she needs to do. So if we look at anxiety, it kind of has these basic characteristics. It kind of has these things, these qualities that we know it always sort of has. One of them is that your thinking patterns get a little somewhat unrealistic. Things can seem a lot more complex, more black and white. It gets a little bit distorted. When we take a look at worry, worry tends to focus back more on things in the past or in the future. So there's a lot of rehashing things that have happened, or a lot of looking ahead and wondering about the what ifs. Well, what if this happens? Physiological responses. So anxiety always has some sort of body response. And quite often, the body response comes on before your brain even clues into what you're feeling anxious about. And in children that we work with, if I had to pick the number one thing kids talk about, it's upset stomach, butterflies in their stomach. They feel like they're sick. Quite often they'll try to stay home. And in the moment, yeah, their stomach really does feel fluttery and butterflyish. We do also meet kids with other responses, and we'll talk about that. And then there's also, with anxiety comes in some behaviors, and they are different for every child and every person. So it is unique and varied to the person. I kind of say that everybody has their own little code or little system that sort of is unique to them. So when we take a look at and talk about anxiety, these three things always go together. You'll often hear about cognitive behavioral therapy being the gold standard for working with anxiety. And it sounds super impressive, but cognitive just means what you're thinking. Behavioral means the stuff that you're doing. And the feelings piece just is always connected. So it's this triangle is actually the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. So one more click, Jenna, and I think what's going to happen is, yeah, we take a look at anxiety, and then you'll see, and I use this analogy, especially with kids who are in grade 4 or older. One more click, that it's like an iceberg. The part that everybody sees is the behavior. What you're thinking and how you're feeling is the stuff that's tucked inside. And actually, that's the biggest piece of it all. If you think of an iceberg, 1/10 is on the surface and 9/10 are underneath the water surface. And so the thoughts and the feelings are the pieces that happen inside of us and people don't see. The behavior part is what everybody sees. When I talk with kids, and even when I'm doing this work with adults, the reality is that behaviors and thoughts can be adjusted and change. You feel what you feel, though. That's connected to your amygdala, and it's connected to your heart, and feelings are feelings. So I can't change your feelings. I can't say to you, I don't want you to be sad anymore. Change your sad. We can't do that, but we can do some things in regards to what your thinking patterns are, and we can do some things in what's happening with your behavior that maybe will make the sad not feel quite so overwhelming. So that's why the arrows are all kind of interconnected. The feelings piece is the one that we can't teach you a tool or strategy, but if we teach you tools and strategies for behaviors and thoughts, those are automatically going to have an impact on feelings. Okay. So anxiety has that top of the iceberg. Those are the behavior pieces that we all do to try to cope. Most kids have this strong urge to do the things or get rid of the thing that they don't like and makes them feel better. So the natural tendency is to avoid the thing that's making you feel anxious. It's not a great tool or strategy, but that's kind of a natural thing that we do. Okay. So when we take a look at some of the things that we all do as people, if we're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, and kids do this a lot too, they just avoid the thing that makes them feel anxious.
Can you just answer, Darb? Yeah, it is. Okay, she's asking.
The other thing people will do is they'll try to leave the situation. They'll ask for reassurance over and over and over again. An example of a student would be grandma's coming to pick them up at school, and when you're dropping them off in the morning, they ask you like 5 or 6 times in different ways. Are you sure grandma's coming? What time is she coming? When will she be there? Where will she be parked? Can you tell me again where grandma's going to be parked? That's a safety action. That's a behavior that's connected with anxiety. They find a safe spot. They try to distract. Kids can sleep or nap. Sometimes lots of kids I know carry something around that they think will help them. And other kids can do things over and over again that sort of are repetitive behaviors. the most common one we see is they avoid the feared situation. And that kind of is the sad piece, because for some kids, then they avoid sleepovers, or they start avoiding school, and they avoid lots of things that just sort of are day-to-day activities that would bring education and benefit and joy to a child. And so as a mental health clinician, we always especially look at school avoidance as something that's a significant issue in terms of anxiety. That would be not functioning well, because if you're not going to school, it would be the same as an adult not going to work. So we want to make sure that we talk about that too. So we'll do a little bit of work on that. So these are the common ones, but these are the ones coming up that sometimes catch us off guard, but we hear a lot of them in our work. Okay, Jenna, you ready? So these are the ones. So they can't think clearly. So you've got a little one who doesn't like to go out for dinner, and you say to them they have to pick from one of two restaurants, and they say, I don't know, you pick. That's the anxiety taking over. They have a really hard time to think clearly. They get very rigid in their thinking. They can become inflexible. They can become aggressive. I know anxious kids who have slammed the door so hard that the door frame has problems, or punched the wall so hard that the drywall, or they can be really hard on family members in terms of kicking or screaming. There can be huge, intense frustration. There can be crying, and you can get to the place of complete shutdown, that they just can't engage. I've seen little ones just even curl up in a ball because they're so overwhelmed. The one thing that I want to say, if we can just go back for a sec, Jenna, these behaviors, remember, it's the top of the iceberg, so it's the stuff you see. But I also want to be really clear that just because your child has anxiety, it doesn't mean that these behaviors are acceptable. And so sometimes we run into children who have become very aggressive, and it's allowed to happen over time because their parents or their caregivers are aware that the aggression comes out when they're anxious. Anxiety doesn't give you permission to behave in a way that hurts property, harms other people, is behavior that is considered to be aggressive or inappropriate. Anxiety doesn't give you an open free pass card to be allowed to do that. So those behaviors still need to have appropriate consequences for them. Okay, so you want to just be careful that just because he's anxious, it doesn't mean that your child is, it's okay for them to destroy your property in your home. Okay, and I always say to parents, if you're seeing this now when they are 5, 6, 7, 8, where do you want this to look like when they're 14, 15, 16? Like, we need to make sure that we are on top of those behaviors. Okay, so the anxious body has this stuff that's happening inside and then stuff that's happening outside. So when we were talking about those sort of body symptoms or the somatic symptoms, there are a ton of things that happen in the body when anxiety is increasing. So there's hormones and blood vessels, and all these things sort of get very vigilant, and even things like senses. You might notice that the anxious kid seems to be able to hear things when they're just kind of at the place that they're starting to lose it. They hear things, they smell things, everything just sort of is heightened for them. And then there's the noticeable effects, the physical things that people feel. So headaches and dry mouth and rapid heartbeat and the stomach ache and diarrhea and all of those things. Those are the noticeable effects of anxiety. And we all have our own combination. I am a stomach upset, numbness in my arms, lump in my throat kind of person. But you know what? I don't think I really figured that out until I was probably an adult. I know I had all those symptoms when I was a kid, but the connection was never made between those and anxiety at all. And so if we can get to a place that our kids are able to sort of just tell us what's happening maybe in their bodies a little bit, it's wonderful. I worked with a girl just recently whose family had spent tons of money on Gravol and a Tums and a whole bunch of work in terms of medical tests and things. And at the end of the day, what ended up happening for her was anxiety. And when we started to name it and give her some tools and strategies, that started to be less and less of a concern for her. And now when the butterflies come around, she says to me, I know the difference between food poisoning butterflies and I'm nervous or upset. I'm nervous or anxious about something. And she's in grade 5. So it easily can be done. And the next slide will show, even with little people, we could talk about shaky knees and pounding heart and butterfly tummy and hot forehead or all of those things. So we can easily talk about those in terms of the worry body for little kids. And sometimes it's just you naming it, just saying, oh, it sounds like your worried tummy is acting up again. Something must be coming up that you're having a bit of a worry about. And you just kind of normalize it. I think the lovely part, though, as for you being here as parents, is that we all have our own combination. We all experience anxiety. And as parents or caregivers, it would be so powerful to let your child know when you're feeling anxious and what signals your body is sending you. And the reason that is we don't have those conversations with our kids. And since it's happening internally, the anxious little brain feels that they're the only one that has this. They're the only one that has this struggle, because when they look at everybody else seems to be doing just fine. And we have to start talking about anxiety in just a some more calm, informative way so that kids know that they're not alone. And I think I could talk about that from experience because I have this very amazing job, but I was the worst anxious kid when I went to school. And I have to say, through my entire school career, not one teacher ever spoke about anxiety, and my parents never did either. And I thought something was terribly wrong with me because I couldn't go to a play date. And I cried instead of doing a presentation in front of the class because nobody explained to me what anxiety was and how powerful that would have been. So I think start early with the conversations. There's huge benefit. So we talked about the behaviors, the top of the iceberg, and now we're going under the water. So we're going into thoughts. So when you're feeling anxious or your anxiety is starting to percolate up, your patterns of thinking shift and you start to notice things and you're just more hypervigilant about what's going over and you're starting to sense way more danger. So a prime example is me driving over here tonight. I've driven over here thousands of times, but as I'm driving here, do I have my cell phone? Do I have my keys? What if I don't have my keys? Oh my gosh, the janitor's not going to be there and he's not going to let me in. And then I started to think about, but I've just showed up in like sweatpants and my kind of slipper shoes. And then, but that's okay. And then I had to talk myself through, but it's okay because I'm on Zoom and nobody really sees that part of my body. And normally this would not be part of my thinking pattern at all. But I know my anxiety is kind of percolating up a bit because I'm doing something that's not quite in my ultimate comfort zone. This happens with kids. So when they're starting to feel anxious, they start to notice things around them, especially possible sources of danger, really quickly. And so they start to notice sounds or things much quicker than you would realize. So the kid who's anxious to go to dance class might start listening for your car keys rattling, or are we getting something together that sort of gives them a sign or signal that they have to go to dance soon, and then all the anxiety is going to percolate up a little bit more. Okay. So let's take a look at that thinking part of the triangle. So how we're thinking has a really big impact on how we feel and what we do and our body reactions. And the data shows that really all of us kind of have the same thoughts, even if you don't have really heightened anxiety. We all have the same thoughts go through our brain. But for people who have a little bit more anxiety than others, it tends to stick like Velcro. And so what happens is for people who don't have that same sort of heightened anxiety or worry, it kind of like slides off like Teflon. So that's why we have the visual of the Teflon plate and the egg there. So it just slides away. The anxious people and the anxious kid, it sticks like Velcro. So there's a math quiz tomorrow. Everyone in the class probably is maybe not prepared for the math quiz. Hard to say. And everybody in for probably a minute's going, oh, there's a math quiz tomorrow. I don't know how I'm going to do that. A lot of the kids are just going to be like, well, whatever. I've got soccer tonight and, you know, it's another math quiz, whatever. Teflon, the egg slides off, it's gone. The anxious kid, oh, there's a math test tomorrow. I'm going to fail. I'm so terrible at math. And they go to the next class, or they have social studies next. And now they're still thinking about the math quiz they're going to have the next day. And then they get home and they're fretting about the math quiz, and they maybe cry at dinner because there's a math quiz, and they hang on to it a little bit more. It Velcros with them. So it's not as though anxious people have different thoughts. It's that anxious people hang on to them and they stick. They keep coming around. So anxious kids have thoughts that don't go away, and then sometimes their thoughts can get distorted. So it can kind of take on a life of its own and can start to sort of become magnified, or they perseverate on it, or it just starts to sort of become this fortune telling. I'm going to fail the test. And you're like, how do you know you're going to fail the test? Because their thinking just gets larger and larger and larger. So with kids, I call these ants, automatic negative thoughts, and we all have them. But quite often with children who are anxious, they come along really quickly and they can stay. And even as adults, we all have automatic negative thoughts. Adults with anxiety have automatic negative thoughts. And I can give you an example of going to like a staff Christmas party. For about 90% of the staff, going to the staff Christmas party in a normal world is like nothing. You go to the party or you don't go to the party. There is going to be this small proportion of people at work who have heightened anxiety, and they're going to be like, well, I don't want to go because I don't know who's going to be there. But if I do go, then people are going to be like watching me maybe closely because I have to go by myself. But if I don't go, then people are going to wonder why I didn't go. And so you can see how your thinking can start to get quite busy and distorted. And often I say to anxious kids, look how tired they must be if they have to do all this extra thinking. Like, look how busy their brains are. They're doing so much extra thinking than everybody else. The most important message that I ever can give to kids is that just because you think something, it doesn't mean it's true. And that's a kind of big concept even for adults to get. So if you just sort of pause and think about that for a bit, we think lots of things in our day. We have thousands of thoughts in our day, but just because you're thinking something doesn't mean it's true. And so we have to really be careful with that, even as adults, what we do with our thinking patterns and what that looks like. Okay. So I always do this with, yeah, sure, that's fine, Jenna. I do this with kids who are maybe from grade 4 up to grade 7, because they always will say, well, no, I don't know if I can do anything about my thinking. My thinking is what it is. And I always say to them, well, let's try. And I'll say, okay, so we just had recess. I want you right now to think really closely and tell your entire stomach to stop digesting the granola bar. And they'll sit for a minute and they'll be like, oh, I can't make my stomach do that. Okay, so let's try this one. Think about like your circulatory system. I want you to see if you can tell your heart to stop sending blood like to your feet. Oh, no, I can't do that. I can't shift and change that system. Okay, so what about if I want you to think about your biggest worry that you've had today? So anxious kids can do that really quickly. And I said, now I want you to think about the best gift someone ever gave you. And now I want you to think about if you were picking dessert for dinner, what would you choose? And now I want you to think about something that went really well for you today. And they can answer all those questions. And I say, so we do have a little bit of control over what we're thinking. And the reality is we have a lot of control over what we're thinking and being aware of our thoughts. So that is how that piece of that iceberg, that CBT triangle, is something we can shift and change a little bit. Okay. So anxiety, just so you have an awareness, is the #1 mental health issue that we're dealing with children. And it's estimated that about 1 in 4 kids are challenged with anxiety. And if we think about our general population, about 1 in 10 adults have significant anxiety. So the reality is, in your typical day, you're going to run across people who are having struggles with anxiety more than people who are maybe having struggles with heart disease or things like that. So it's important to have an awareness of how prevalent it is, which means that it occurs a lot in our general population. Remembering that everyone has anxiety. When we're challenged with anxiety, that just means our anxiety is interfering with our ability to enjoy life. Okay. So when does typical anxiety turn into something that's more of a disorder or something we really need to be concerned about? There's kind of 4 things we look at. So the first one is distress. How much distress is this causing? I think, Jenna, you just have to hit the little button. How much distress? The other one is how much disruption? How much is just disrupting your life? How long has this gone on for? So if it is something that has only been going on for a day or 2, that would not be considered something turning into a disorder. It probably is just a momentary adjustment. If it's going on for 6 weeks to 2 months to 3 months, that's a longer duration. And we also want to take a look, is this developmental? So at the beginning, we talked about those things we expect at certain ages. So is this fitting in a developmental stage? And if it is, then that doesn't become a disorder. So I'll give you an example of that. If we have a youngster who is starting kindergarten and during these very strange COVID times hasn't had the opportunity to go to preschool, hasn't really had a lot of social interaction, they are going to have some issues separating from parent to go to school, because this is a huge stage for them. And separation is something often we see in that 3 to 6-year-old age group. If, however, your child has always gone to school beautifully and suddenly they're 12 years old in grade 7 and you cannot get them out of the car and there's yelling and screaming and it starts the night before that they don't want to go to school and they don't want to separate from you, developmentally, that is not what we typically expect. And so that would be an area of concern. And hopefully that makes makes sense to you all, that you can understand the difference with that sort of developmental piece. The other piece that's really important to know is that for anxiety to be an anxiety disorder, it needs to go through a professional for a DSM-5 diagnosis. So we're always really aware, especially at schools, that unless you have been through a pediatrician or a psychiatrist, your kid might have heightened anxiety or be struggling with anxiety, but we want to be really careful not to label it as an anxiety disorder. And I'm always saying to parents often that when your child is experiencing some of those somatic symptoms, the heartbeat, the funny tummy, maybe a little bit of trouble breathing, especially for young ones, let's be really careful not to name that as a panic attack. Because once kids start to get that language, it's really, really hard to shift them. And for young kids to hear those words of panic attack, it just kind of puts it at a whole different level. Try to just say, wow, your body's sending you a lot of signals that something isn't feeling comfortable or that you need to pay attention to something. Good. So I just want to be really clear about that. And it's the same, you know what? It's the same with other mental health issues. We all have moments of depression when our mood feels low, and even for a few days, it's hard to get moving and get going. That does not mean we have a diagnosed depressive disorder. That's very different. So we just want to be clear with that language. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about your role as a parent coach. So parent coaches are the most important people for anxiety mitigation or starting to get anxiety on track to a more healthy place. So what you do consistently during the day brings about the greatest change. And quite often, if I'm running a group or doing one-to-one sessions with clients, I think sometimes parents think I have this incredible magic wand that the hour their child spends with me is going to fix it all. And the reality is what you do every day during the day as things percolate up is going to be the most change worthy. You can reinforce on the spot. And what you need to do is start modeling some solutions and tools rather than reinforcing the ineffective coping strategies. So the most common ineffective coping strategy is I'm not going to do it. And so we want to be really careful as parents that we just don't say, okay, then you don't have to. Because then we get to a place of a kid that ends up not doing anything and having a really, really miserable time. So I always say to parents, you're the coach. You don't have to fix this for them. It is hard as a parent to watch your child struggle. And our natural tendency as parents is to make everything better for them. With anxiety, absolutely you want to do the same thing, but the way you make it better for them is to help them with tools and strategies. So tools and strategies are similar for anxiety in many ways, from young children to mid-aged children to teenagers to adults. It's just that we kind of tweak them or make them more age appropriate. So when you're working with a little one, if you're a parent listening, say your child is age probably 7 and younger, a lot of the tools and strategies you're going to have to do them with. So we call that sort of a co-reinforcement or co-doing. You have to do that with them. You can't just be in the moment and say, okay, I want you to just go to your room now and do some of the breathing stuff. Little people can't do that on their own independently. They need co-parents. They need co-coaches that can help them in the moment. And we'll talk about that when we get to tools and strategies. Okay, Jenna, I think I'm talking too much because I want to make sure we get to the tools and strategies. So we'll go a bit quicker. I just always toss this in because the anxious apple doesn't fall far from the anxious apple tree. So if you as an adult have some anxiety, I want you to be aware of that because quite often you may interpret your child's anxiety differently based on your experiences. So it's just something to be really aware of. Okay, good. So kids learn to cope over time. You as a parent will need to be supported too as much as possible. Our main goal with the kids is when we're looking at that anxiety iceberg, we want them to try to shift behavior, but it doesn't matter what the outcome is. It's just, did they try to behave? Did they try to talk back to that worry? Did they face the worry and acknowledge it and try to do some things? You want to make sure that you identify your own reactions and attitudes towards anxiety. And you want to always try as best as you can to remain calm, realizing that you're human. And if you kind of lose it sometimes because you're really tired of dealing with the same thing every night when you're trying to go to bed, there might be a night that you are not the superstar parent and would not be put on a poster, but that's okay. We're all human. Okay. So we always show this little slide. It's a good one. You cannot bubble wrap your child. Well, you can, but I have to tell you in the long term, it's not going to help them at all. So you want to make sure that we start moving into tools and strategies to help them move forward. This is not the one we want to use. So it's a myth that talking to your kids about anxiety is going to make them more anxious. If anything, it's going to help them understand anxiety. Okay, Jenna, move on. If you're okay with that. If you provide accurate information, it actually helps reduce the confusion of what they're feeling. And if you stay calm when you talk about anxiety, your child will stay calm too. If you present it as anxiety is a big problem, then I guarantee you anxiety is going to be a big problem. So we want to make sure that we give accurate information and age appropriate information. So talking about parenting, be really just thoughtful as a parent. Are you often critical? Do you tend to comment more on the things that aren't right? And do you sometimes hover and double check things that they don't do correctly? Because quite often Remember, we talked about everybody hears the same messages, but the anxious kid's going to Velcro those a lot more than every other child that you may have. And you may have a family with 4 children, and 3 of them have just gone through tickety-boo with the exact same parenting style. And then and one of the children is really struggling with some of the things. And the reality is we can't parent all of our kids the exact same. They all come as different little packages. So sometimes things have to be a little bit different. And parents sometimes say to me that that's not fair. So what I always try to say to them is you've got to be careful that kids don't mix up the 2 words of fair and equal. Equal means that everybody gets the exact same. Fair means that everybody gets what they need. And so some kids have different needs. So if one of your kids needs a little extra time with you at night and the other ones are okay to read independently, then it may not be equal, but you can do something a little bit later to sort of have the other child's needs be met. You're never going to be able to have it all be equal amongst your kids. It just is never going to work, and some kids need a little bit more. Okay. So the next slide's a bit long, but just be really realistic about expectations for all of this. We are not curing anything. If you're anxious, your child is going to read that. It's almost like anxious kids are sponges for other anxious people around it. It's like they pick up an energy. The strategies are lifelong. We've talked about this. It's a slow process. Some of the tools will work better for some kids than others. And I always say, change it up, do whatever works for your kid. Give this tool and strategy a fair try, and don't get rid of tools and strategies, just keep adding to. So more than one strategy is always the way to go. And so I often will meet a kid and they'll say, yeah, I did that once and it didn't work for me. And I'm like, yeah, you got to do it way more than once. And it's okay. Let's just add this one in. So now we have 2. And let's try adding this one in. So now maybe we have 3. So that's all beneficial and good for kids. Okay. So we talked a little bit about that bravery piece. And so the next little diagram that Jen is going to pull out is we want to make sure that we're rewarding the effort, not the outcome. So there's a scared part and there's a doing it part, and the piece in the middle is the bravery piece. And so if it's really hard to go to soccer practice and your little one has gotten in the car and they got to the field, and normally they wouldn't even go stand with the team, but they went and stood with the team and they sat on the bench and they cheered their teammates. It may not be quite joining the game yet, but they were super brave and did a lot more than they did the time you went before. And that's the piece you want to be sure you're not getting too hung up in the outcome. It's the effort and how much they tried, because it's a lot of effort when you're anxious to overcome stuff like this. Okay, so tools and strategies are what we're going to spend the rest of our time with. Basic needs include sleep and eating and exercise. Cognitive, remember that just means thinking stuff. So we're going to talk about brave behavior and shifting worries and thoughts. The behavioral stuff is that top of the iceberg. So we're going to look at routine and consistency and all those sort of things. And then still in the behavioral piece is what we call physical strategies. So what are some things that we can do to help quieten that busy body that's sending all these messages and help your body get to a place of being a little bit calmer? So when we work with kids, we always try to think of using a measurement tool. And the one that we use, if you're okay to move over, Jenna, is a measurement tool. We use a fear thermometer. It's a nice way to know when kids are rating high and when they are low. So if you have a little one, you can keep the rating small and just have it be from 1 to 5. Older kids are pretty good going up to 10. The lower the number, the less anxious they are feeling. We're all human and we're all alive and we all have some anxiety. So we're all going to be at 1 most of the time, sometimes up to 2, 3, 4, 5. 4, 5, 6, we can kind of manage. 7, 8, 9, 10 is when that stomach starts to happen and it feels overwhelming. So the next slide will show a worry thermometer that we often use with kids. So you can make, oh, we're going to send this out, aren't we, Jenna? Because we've got everybody. we're going to send all of those out to you by email, so you can have those to print off if you want. It's really good just to have on the fridge, and you can just have a simple check-in. It's way easier than saying, you look anxious. Are you feeling worried? What are you feeling? Like, how worried are you today? And you can get to a point that you can just say, so where's your worry today? What number are you at? And then you can get to the place that everybody just like shows up a couple fingers or something easy like that. Or you have Post-it notes, or they just put their fingers on the table, and you can see when you're out at grandma's house, they've just put their 2 hands on the table, and you can see that they're showing 6 of their fingers. It's just a really nice, easy way to communicate. And it's also a nice way to sort of say, so if we do a couple strategies, can we get from a 9 to a 7? And I'm always really clear with kids that there is not a tool that we know of that's going to take you from a 10 down to a 1. It doesn't exist. Okay. So let's talk about the first things that we have to talk about. Oh, Jenna, look at my little calendar move. That's okay. We have to talk a bit about diet. We find if kids have too much caffeine, especially when it comes to bedtime, and there can be hidden caffeine in things that are cocoa or coffee flavored or whatever. You want to make sure that your kid has a healthy diet. It's okay if you have a grazer that just needs to eat constantly, but just little bits at a time and doesn't really like eating meals. Because we all know when you're not eating well and you're feeling hangry, that everything feels a little bit more overwhelming. Okay. Sleep is critical for anxious kids. We all know that when your head hits the pillow, it is often a time for you to be alone with your thoughts, because the rest of the day is busy and distracting and there's lots of stuff to think of. So your head hits the pillow, and all of a sudden that busy, anxious brain starts to do a bunch of thinking about what happened that day or what's going to happen the next day. And sleep is a really huge challenge for a lot of anxious kids. So the sort of rule of thumb, sleep is an issue for your youngster if they can't fall asleep within 20 to 30 minutes. If falling to sleep takes longer than that, then that's a bit of a concern for you. The other suggestion we have for sleep, get TVs out of their bedrooms, anything with blue light. Falling asleep with the iPad is not the greatest. If they can have a light on and read a book or do something boring like a little word search book that you got at the dollar store or something plain like that is better. Absolutely, sometimes you need to use a cell phone or an app if you're putting some music or something calming on at night. What we know about the brain, and this is the same for kids or adults, is if you have a bedtime routine, your brain starts to get prepared for sleep when you start that bedtime routine. And it naturally kicks in with that melatonin for sleep when it starts to get darker and into the evening. So if you have a routine that they always brush their teeth, maybe, or have a snack, brush their teeth, pajamas, read in their bed a little bit, have a chance to snuggle in, one hug, one kiss, whatever you need to do, then sleep can kind of become this routine. And then their brain is like, oh, this is what I do every single night. This is how sleep looks for me. And your brain starts to be aware. I put the Etch-a-Sketch in there because ages ago, I heard someone talk about sleep as being like an Etch-a-Sketch, in that your whole day you spend drawing and moving those knobs all over the place till it's like a full Etch-a-Sketch. And then what happens is at night, the restorative part of your brain tucks away the pieces of the day that it needs to, that are sort of awesome memories or bits of learning that it needs to keep. And then the rest of the Etch-a-Sketch gets cleared off. So then the next day you can start all the drawing again with moving the knobs back and forth. If you're not getting enough sleep, what happens is your Etch-a-Sketch doesn't get cleared off. And so you start the next day with already a full screen. And now you're going to put more stuff on top of it. And then if the next night you're not sleeping, then you're starting again with a full screen. So your brain and your body never get a chance to just sort of let it go down and have a calm moment. Jen and I have laughed about an Etch-a-Sketch. Jenna, I had a client today who didn't know how to clear the Etch-a-Sketch. I had to teach her that you shake it. So that made me feel very, very old. Exercise is super important for everybody, but for anxious kids, And that means even more than formal exercise. Quite often I'll meet kids who go to hockey for, 3 hours a week. But if they could just go outside and play and be on their scooters and have fun in the snow, all that stuff is important. Just get out, get some fresh air. Sometimes even therapists talk about something called vitamin T, vitamin trees, and nature, and all of that stuff has a huge impact on your brain and your ability to cope. Laughter is great, and quite often I have kids have a laughter library that's a tool of corny jokes they've heard or funny things that have happened. So when anxiety is feeling overwhelming, we can just say the corny, awful joke, and then everybody laughs, and we can kind of have a moment to just sort of decompress all of that a little bit. It's really hard to laugh and have a lot of fun and be highly stressed and highly anxious. And the last piece we always just add in, and this hasn't been that big of a concern in recent days, but the scheduling. Sometimes kids have a lot of stuff that they have to go to. So just be aware of how much scheduling there is in your family and in your day-to-day busyness. And it may not even be scheduling for the anxious child, but are they having to go in the car a lot to take their sisters to dance, to stop and pick something up? Anxious kids do good with having a adequate amount of downtime, just time that they can sort of decompress. Okay. So moving still into sort of behavioral stuff, breathing is the #1 thing we know helps calm the anxious brain and helps regulate your system. If you go to Adult Mental Health and take one of their anxiety sessions, they're going to talk with you about breathing and practicing breathing. The thing is with kids, especially young kids, sometimes for an adult to sit across from them and do the in through your nose, out through your mouth breathing can be a little bit something they're not interested in. So for little people, I always say, have a pinwheel in the car. If you can on the deck, have one of those dollar store containers of bubbles. I also do breathing with kids that we practice with a straw and just put milk in a glass, and how slow can you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and how many bubbles can you make? And once you start using some of these, you can use those then at other times when you actually physically don't have the stuff. It's okay for you to just say, let's pretend we have pinwheels. We're going to hold them in our hand and breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth. And that's imprinted in their brains because it was fun and they enjoyed doing it with you. As kids get a bit older, absolutely, you can start adding in some breathing. If it's not something you feel comfortable with, there are tons of YouTube videos. There are some apps we'll talk about at the end that you can add in just in terms of breathing and calming down that breath system. It is a huge, huge tool in terms of reducing anxiety, getting you from a 7 down to a 5. Okay. Another thing that we move into is progressive muscle relaxation. When you're anxious, your muscles just naturally tense up and you often don't even notice. So with little kids, you're not going to be able to say to them, let's lay down and do a half hour of this progressive muscle relaxation or YouTube video. Kids aren't going to do that. But little people love stuff. Put some music on and pretend for a little while you're robots, tight and stiff. And then in a few 30 seconds later, switch over to jellyfish or rag dolls. And then you're all loose and floppy. That is super easy to do. And kids love it. And if you have, and you'll have to do it with them. So we talked about that co-regulation. Co-regulation when you start doing the breathing, co-regulation when you're doing progressive muscle relaxation. I use spaghetti with kids, young kids up into intermediate ages for sure. So cooked spaghetti versus raw uncooked spaghetti. If you're anxious, you're that raw spaghetti, tight and hard. And if you are feeling a little looser, you are that gentle, lovely spaghetti that's just sort of rolling. I often teach with kids who are in, say, grade 4 and up, progressive muscle stuff that they could do in the classroom that nobody knows. So even where you're sitting right now, if you grab the bottom of your chair and you were pulling up really, really hard and then just let go, that's a type of muscle relaxation. So you're tensing it all up, being aware of the tension, letting it go, it's relaxing. You can do that in your chair at school and no one will know what's happening. No one will have any awareness at all. Okay. Part of that too, we also often add in for anxious kids, things like fidgets. Always touch base with the teacher to see what they feel comfortable with. Most teachers are really good, except for the ones that are super noisy and do a lot of distracting spinning. But anxious kids have a tendency to want to sometimes have something in their hands. Sometimes anxious kids will want to have a release of that energy orally. They might be ones that chew their hoodie strings a lot. All of that kind of stuff. Sometimes they can have a necklace that they can spin back and forth. There's lots of things you can do as they get a bit older too that feel a little bit more age appropriate. I have kids in grade 7 who have a special ring that they can just spin on their finger, which helps with that sort of energy and sort of awareness of what their muscles are doing. Okay, so that's sort of physical behavioral stuff. And now we're going to move on to the thinking stuff. And so the other person is saying, like, what is that? And the anxious kid's just saying, well, that's just my brain. It's really busy. And that's what anxious kids tell us all the time. My brain is just always so busy. So this is the thinking piece of it all. So when we talk about thoughts, we all have this natural self-talk, these inner dialogues that we have in our brain. And anxious kids tend to have ones that are a little more unhelpful or not very kind to themselves. So Jen, I don't know if you're okay to move over. Quite often, this is sort of the vocabulary I hear from anxious kids. It's unhelpful, and it just automatically goes to things that aren't going to go. I'm stupid. No one at school likes me. Anxious kids who don't want to be away from their parents. I know there's going to be an accident. They tend to have self-talk that can be really, really hard on them. So the things we know about self-talk, it's just kind of like this internal language we have inside of ourselves without saying it out loud. So nobody really knows we're doing it. We have lots of thoughts during the day. So in a typical day, apparently we all have like anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 thoughts going through our brain. And that's not all the other messages our brain's receiving. So anxious kids have a lot of thinking going on, and quite often the thoughts can be really different. So we all are in the same situation, but anxious kids have a lot busier thoughts. Scoot over one, Jenna, for me, if you can, if that's okay. The thing with thoughts is too that they're private. So unless you tell other people what's happening, nobody knows what's really happening in your thinking. And quite often anxious kids don't want to tell you what their thoughts are. They can be really nervous about that. And so it's lovely if you can model a little bit of that yourself as an adult. Just say, oh, I've got to do this big presentation for the boss today. And I'm not sure how that's going to go. Man, I'm kind of having some worries about that. I hope I'll do okay. So we want to make sure that we're aware of self-talk. Here's the thing with little kids, and that's why we tend to talk about the thoughts or the thinking parts. You have to be aware of your child's ability to comprehend the concept of thinking, because quite often little kids will be like, well, no, I don't have other voices in my heads and I don't think other stuff than other people. If they're not at that place, don't push it, but you will get to a cognitive or a place of understanding, usually around grade 4-ish, that they really do start to understand the concept of thoughts, and that everyone has thoughts that are in our brains. They are not voices, they are thoughts. And so we want to make sure that we really sort of focus on that, especially for the kids from 4 to 7. We really start to have to talk more about thoughts. Okay. All right, Jenna, I think the next one's a little frog. Okay. So just because you think something doesn't mean it's necessarily true. So we have to be really, really careful about that. The next slide shows you a little bit about M&Ms. So all M&Ms are great. We love them all. They're full of chocolate. But thoughts are the same. There aren't good thoughts and bad thoughts. So I always try to say to parents, be really careful that you don't say some thoughts are bad, because no thoughts are bad. All thoughts are okay. So we want to make sure that we just sort of rephrase it a little bit, maybe into more thoughts that are helpful and some thoughts that are maybe a little unhelpful. And so I just use that phrasing with kids. Well, yeah, that's for sure. That's a thought you probably are having. It's not a really helpful one, though. It probably is not letting you do some things that you enjoy doing. So they're not good or bad. Okay. So when we talk about thought tools, and I want to say some of you will have anxious kids who tell you everything and want to tell you everything all the time. And some of you will have an anxious kid who just holds it all inside. And you don't want to push this, but you want to sort of introduce the tools and strategies in a way that works for them. So one of the tools we teach kids, especially kids who are a little bit older, because remember the thinking is sometimes for a little bit older kids, is we teach them about thought stopping. So think about something, think about your worry, and now think about your favorite pet, and then go back to your worry and go back to your favorite pet. So you do have a bit of an ability to control what you're thinking. And what we talk about kids often is something we just refer to as when a lot of unhelpful thoughts come around. They're not bad, but sometimes we have to stop them or stop them from coming around so often. So often kids will say that they think of their own things that they could put in their brain as an image for like stopping the thought. Would it be a stop sign? Would it be a dandelion that the seeds blow away? Would it be a cloud that goes by? I had a young client the other day who told me it would just be like this horrible sucking vacuum that would like just suck, like kinds you would use to suck all the guts out of stuff. And I was like, well, that's a good one. But as long as it works for the kid, it doesn't matter. So when those thoughts come through and they start to stick like Velcro, can you just put up a sign, or could you just in your mind see an image of yourself blowing that one away? We always want to say to kids too, that just because you stop a thought doesn't mean it's not going to come back again. And that's okay. To be kind to yourself and not be too harsh on yourself. If that thought comes back, just send it on its way again, or put the stop sign up again. And if it comes back again, and it probably will, that's okay. Just do that over and over again. For older kids, we take a look at something we call a worry holder, a place that they can write down their worries. They can put them on a slip of paper. If they don't like writing, they can draw a picture of it, and they can put it in that holder for safekeeping. It is not magical. It is not going to get rid of that worry, but it is almost like you're putting it on a shelf for another time. If you need to deal with it later, you can, but you're putting it away somewhere. And I met a parent in one of our parent group who said that she has a worry box she's kept since she was in high school, and she was in her late 30s. And she says, you know what? Some of them still come back around that I have to deal with, but a lot of things that I put in that box, they were able to stay there, and it didn't become an issue along the way. The one caveat with that is we want to make sure that you don't have this box have the impression that it's magical, that it's going to be something magic happens with that box. So I can have kids say to me, I worry about my mom and dad, they've gotten a divorce and I'd like them to get back together again. And they put that in the box with this hope that this is going to happen. And it is not a magic box. It is not magical at all. So they can put that worry about what's happening to their family in there, but it doesn't have magical powers. If you have a child who talks a lot about worries, kind of all day is consuming, you may want to add in something called worry time. And worry time is anywhere, don't have it go longer than 10 minutes. And I think 10 minutes is even too long. I would start with 8 at the most, or go down to 5. And you are just going to block this time for undivided attention for them to talk about their worries. You're not going to solve them. You're going to listen. And what will happen is, over time, your kids will learn a little bit that they can contain their worries. They have enough skill and adaptation that they don't have to have you dealing with their worries 24/7. You don't have to be the tool that you listen to them and you're available all the time. They do get a chance to tell you what's worrying them. they get acknowledgement, and what you'll find over time is there won't be as much to worry about. And sometimes they'll even just sit there and say, well, I don't have anything else to add to worry time today. But it's scheduled in, so you've got it there and they know they have it. Older kids, I have them have a little journal that they can write down things that they want to make sure they want to talk about during worry time. So they've kind of acknowledged what they need to. You can say, you know what? And if they start talking, you say, you know what? That sounds something really great to talk about during worry time. Make sure worry time is not bedtime. So what often happens is your child gets to bed, their head's on the pillow, and quite often you'll say something like, and it's just comes from a loving place. So tell me about your day. Did anything happen today that you want to talk about? And I can tell you that if that happened to me when I put my head on the pillow, that's the only thing I would then start thinking about as I was trying to go to sleep. So worry time is better if you're like doing dinner prep, or you always unload the dishwasher at a certain time or whatever. You just want to have an opportunity to be present and like be able to really be listening to them. Or even if you sit on the couch and put a fuzzy blanket around yourselves, whatever you need to do, put a little timer on, and then you can go on about that. If you have little people, sometimes they really just like to draw a picture of the worry and name it so that you can kind of externalize it. You can just say, oh, you know what? That sounds like Mr. Worryhead, and he's so annoying and he drives us crazy. So let's just take a look at him and just say, not in this room, Mr. Worryhead. We've had enough of you today. And you could just sort of shift it and leave it that way. Okay, Jenna, I think we're doing pretty good. So when we talked about the M&Ms, so there's the unhelpful thoughts, there's the helpful thoughts, and in the middle, that yellow section is what we call thought challenging, is when we try to shift the unhelpful thoughts to ones that are more helpful. So the first step is determining if a thought is helpful or unhelpful, and that is easily something a child aged 8 or 9 up can do, is sort of have a chance to say, well, I don't think that's very helpful. So that's sort of an unhelpful thought. And then we sort of move into some thought challenging, so we can maybe shift it into a bit of a more helpful thought. So the next slide talks about some thought challengers. So these are just questions you can ask as a parent. So the worry's coming around. Is it whispering something that's a fact or a fib? Like, is this a truth, or is it maybe not 100% truthful? I use the next thought challenge, especially with kids in grade 6 and 7. If your best friend came up and told you they had this thought or this worry, what would you say to them? Oh, I would tell them that not to worry about the math test, because you know what? They're really good at math and it's only one quiz and they've done really well in the other units. And I'm like, then you have to start talking to yourself like you're a good friend of them. You can always ask, are you 100% sure this is going to happen? If this does happen, like, what's the chance of that? And if, like, what would be the worst thing that could possibly happen? Because sometimes kids are really afraid to just say it out there, and sometimes they just need to say it. And if that did happen, could you cope or handle it? You know, it might be hard, but do you think you would get through? So you want to just really challenge that thinking behavior as much as you possibly can. Okay. So in the thinking piece, we also can do things in terms of positive affirmations. So sometimes kids like to carry little cards in their pockets. Little tiny things are attached to their backpack. And you can just say, okay, I have things that, you know, I've got this, or today I can handle this, or you know what, I've got a whole bunch of them sitting looking at me at my desk right now at work. Just things that in the moment I maybe have to glance over just to give me a little reminder. If you have a kid who has a cell phone, you can add these in as instant messages that you put on, or these sort of phrases that you just kind of have visuals that pop up that just are just nice, subtle reminders of how things are going. Okay, Jenna, I think we're kind of moving on to our last tool. So the last tool that we often use with kids is something called exposure work. It's facing worries on repeatedly doing something until the anxiety is reduced. So you want to start with something that is a low level anxiety for your child. Do not start with the thing that is the most terrifying for them. And it needs to be something that they're capable of managing. And this is never a force. This is always something you do in conjunction with your child. So an example of an exposure would be, this was something for me as a kid, don't like going into the basement by yourself. Okay, so it may be that that's a really challenging situation for your child. So you may say, so let's start at the top of the stairs and we're going to take a couple breaths and then we're together going to walk down to the landing and then walk back up. And you just keep doing that until your child says, you know what, that kind of feels like a 2 or a 3 or a 4 on that sort of rating scale we did. Well, then let's take it up one little notch. What do you think if this time I stand at the top of the stairs and you go down the stairs yourself to the landing and then come back up? So you just do it and then you keep going with that. So you just keep adding little steps, having your kid be part of the planning. And you know what? Over time, it gets a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And then they sort of have this element and huge feeling of success, which is great. Okay, Jenna, I think we're good. So it's little safe steps and always do their least anxiety provoking situation first. So I've had kids do this for answering the telephone. So at the beginning, we might just pretend answering the telephone. And then we get to a place that grandma phones and we know it's grandma, so they answer the phone. And then we get a little bit further so that we really make sure that we sort of base it on little baby steps at a time. So Jenna and I are going to include for you 2 little sort of handouts. The first one is called Hopping Down the Worry Path. And I use this with my young ones, anything from, I would say age 5-ish up to maybe age 8. And you just sort of talk about, so what is it we want to accomplish? And it might just even be something basic, like an ability for some kids, even just to like not have an adult in the bathroom with them at home. So it may just be, so the first step is mom's going to stand at the door and leave the door open. And the second step is mom's going to stand in the hallway with the door open. And you keep doing it and doing it and doing it until it doesn't become an issue. Doesn't mean you need to keep doing it and doing it for hours and hours in one day. You may stay at step 1 for a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden it's like, so do you think we're ready to move up to step 2? Because then you could sort of start working on that together. So you'll see the other one is for older kids, and you'll see that they sort of rank their fear about starting at the bottom. You would sort of write in the steps. And when we start that step, how overwhelming does that feel on a rating from 1 to 10? So that's sort of an example of an exposure ladder. Okay. So we wanted to just touch about a couple of things before we end, and we may not get to all of the slides, but that's quite okay. Challenges with separation are significant challenges for kids who are anxious. So that is something that you may need some additional help with. If they're little, that is something to be expected. But remember, developmentally, if they're moving into grade 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're having trouble separating from school for a long period of time, you want to make sure that you support them. Some parents also find separation challenges after there's been something like Christmas break that is coming up and your child has been home for 2 weeks. Sometimes it's hard to get back into the swing and the routine of school. So you want to start maybe a little bit earlier, talking about getting ready for that, preparing a little bit about your routine a day or 2 before, so that you kind of, nothing is sort of unexpected. Don't do the sneak out thing. Sometimes I've had some parents think it would be really good just to say we're staying at the birthday party, and then they stay a little bit and then they sneak out. That just means that you're sending a message that you're not going to follow through with what you agree with. So make sure that you're always really clear with your anxious child what your plan is. The news and world events. Man, this is a tough one right now. Some families have the 24/7 news channel on, and my recommendation right now is to avoid doing that. It's just too much information and it's overload. So if you have the news or the news is on for little people under the age of probably grade 4-ish, you need to know, often for children that age, when they see an event on the news and then they see an event, the same event again on the news, and maybe then it's shown again from a different angle, their little brains don't process that that's all the same thing and it's shown different times. So I've met with little kids who don't want to travel with their mom and dad to the coast because they saw on the news how many people on the news that morning, how many people are getting killed. And when we inquired a bit more, is they have the news scroller going 24/7. So they heard about a shooting over and over and over and over again. And even though it was the same shooting, their brains interpreted it as like 10 or 15 shootings. So we always have to be aware of how kids are processing things. As their brains develop, often kids start to move into different stages of being concerned about death and dying, especially of a major caregiver. And that is totally normal. Be really careful as a parent. You do not send a message of mom's never going to die, because that is not a truth. The reality is that's the one thing we for sure know that's going to happen for everybody. Kids just need to know that they are loved and there are tons of people to take care of them. And what you'll find with your child is they might ask you a question or two. Just answer that question or two and let them go. And what they might do is go play, and maybe a couple days later, they'll come back and ask you another question or two. Just answer in the moment what they've asked you, and just leave it at that. You don't need to give them a huge ton of additional information, and answer at an age appropriate level. So just be aware of what's appropriate for them. Kids now especially have lots of concern about safety. So what we can do is focus on the things that we as a family, or when we go to school, can talk about. The things that we have control of in terms of safety is huge. There are so many things we can't control. We can't control variants. We can't control government decisions, but we can make sure that there's good hand sanitizers in the house, and that we're using masks at school, and look at all the people who are trying to help. So we want to make sure that we focus on the safety piece. And the last thing I always say is in this discussion section is like, adult stuff isn't kid stuff. So be really careful of phone conversations, things that are happening in your home that you maybe don't want your kids to overhear, because I can guarantee you your anxious kid is hearing it. They seem to have this natural ability to know when you're talking about something that is adult stuff. And quite often it can be easy to sort of include your kid in conversations like that. And even though they may seem incredibly mature, a 12-year-old brain is still a 12-year-old brain, and they don't need to be hearing adult stuff. So just be really aware of conversation. Okay, Jenna, I think the only couple things we were going to talk a little bit quick, maybe we'll just talk about reassurances seeking. So if you have an anxious child, some of them will ask over and over again the same question. And that's a tool that they've learned. They are making you the tool so that you answer them, and then they feel better for a little bit. The problem with this is that that doesn't stop. You're just going to keep answering the question and answering the question. So when your child gets to the place that they have some other tools, and you've learned breathing or progressive muscle relaxation, or you've talked about helpful and unhelpful thoughts, what you can do is just say, you know what? I'm noticing that you're asking me the same question, and that's your worry coming around. So let's try some breathing, or let's try listening to some music, or let's maybe go for a walk, because what's happening is your brain is going back to a pattern of me being the tool to sort of help you feel better. The problem with reassurance seeking is it gets to a place that it never stops. If you think you're out there asking you 4 times, they're going to start asking you 6, and they're going to start asking you 8. You want to be also aware with reassurance seeking that it can be exhaustive. And so you need to be really aware that you're going to, if you're going to deal with this, you're going to deal with it when you're at a time that you feel really well able to cope. And you want to also be careful, because what it does is it sends this message that you have to connect with mom to manage anxiety. And that's no different than the only way your child is going to cope with anxiety is for them to call you from school. That's a type of reassurance seeking, that the only way they can handle this is by phoning you. So you need to start looking at a way of phasing that out. Okay. think we're near the end. Procrastination. Sometimes anxious kids like to put things off because it's how they manage the anxiety coming around. So as they move into school projects and school fairs and things that they have to do, the more you can model breaking things into manageable chunks for anxious kids and setting out timelines really helps. A to-do list that they can take a big fat marker and cross off what they need to do really helps anxious kids sort of have a sense of what things need to look like. Okay. And perfectionism. Some anxious kids have a tendency to have this, that any small mistake or doing an assignment over and over again is what they need to do, or else they are unable to function. And we want to be really cognizant that perfectionism isn't that they want everything to be perfect. It's that they have this worry that they're not doing stuff well enough. They could have done it better. They worry and fret about it. So make sure that you don't sweat the small stuff. Like if the spelling test comes home and they got 8 out of 10, it really doesn't matter. Like it really, in the big scheme of things, it doesn't matter. And I always say to my kids that I work with, try to guess what I got in Science 5, Term 2. What was my mark? No idea. Doesn't matter. No idea. So we want to make sure our messaging is good. So included in here are some great online supports for you. Anxiety Canada is wonderful. You go to the resource section and there's a parent section that has tons of stuff depending on the age of your child. Kelty Mental Health is out of BC Children's Hospital. It is an amazing site. It has podcasts with psychologists and psychiatrists who will talk about anxiety and separation anxiety. And if your kid has trouble with shots or anything like that, and Jen is going to send it out too. So, oh yeah, that's right, Jen, you did that great resource list. So that's a lovely site. And Mindshift comes from Anxiety Canada. It is an app that you can download. It wouldn't be for young children, but easily could be for anyone, I would say grade 6 and up. There are some lovely little online things that you can get for younger children. If you go to other apps and YouTube stuff, there's tons of help stuff for little kids with sleep and all that kind of thing. Okay, so when do you need to get more help? That's our last little add-in. So you need more help when basic functioning is changing, or that you've got it's significantly impaired, when there's lots of distress from the anxiety to your family or to your child, and when you can't explain the anxiety from other factors or developmental stages. And so where can you go in Kamloops? So there are different levels. At the school level, you can start with your classroom teacher, whoever you feel comfortable with. Every school has a learning assistance resource teacher, and there's a school-based team of professionals that include school and family consultants and people who are there to support Aboriginal family counselors. There's a team there, so make sure you reach out at the school level if you feel comfortable doing that. In the community level, if you're lucky enough to have a family physician, they are great first stops for anxiety in kids. Pediatricians are often involved. In Kamloops, there are 2 child and youth teams, one on the North Shore, one on the South Shore, and that will come out in the great resource sheet that Jenna has, how to access them, and they have special intake days. Our Aboriginal partners and services at LMO and Shequetmik have wellness teams, and you can always access private counseling. And often as parents, you can access counseling supports through your employee family assistance programs or your counseling program that has through your employer. Okay, so if we take a look at to date, I think we've covered basics about anxiety. We've talked about tools and strategies and how to keep them appropriate for the age group that kids are at. Remember, no tool and strategy is magical. And a little bit about how to know where to get more help if you need it. Okay, and absolutely, my huge thanks to Jenna today, who's been answering amazing questions on the side. We will stick around a bit. So if you want to type in a few questions, we for sure will be there to answer questions for the next 15 minutes or so. So if you feel more comfortable doing that. Jenna and I also work here out of the Henry Group Education Center. So if you want to touch base with us about something specific, we're more than happy to help. Oh my gosh, I went over and I thought we were going to be under. Now my anxiety feels bad for keeping people too long.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and to Jenna, and again to all the parents who came out tonight. Please reach out if you have any questions. We want to have these sessions that are meaningful and work for your family. So use us as resources. We're here to support you and your children. If anybody has any questions now, what I think I might do is stop the recording, and then people can ask questions if they'd like. And if there's those that have to leave, then that's fine too. So I'll go ahead.